Chapter 1. Clockwork. Dreams. Rewind. The morning mist clung to the cobbled stones of St Mary Mead's High Street like a dowager's lace shawl, reluctant to lift even as the September sun climbed higher. Miss Jane Marple paused at her garden gate, secateurs in one gloved hand, and surveyed the familiar scene with the quiet satisfaction of one who had watched the same view change with the seasons for more years than she cared to count. But today there was something different. Where old Mr Pemberton's dusty haberdashery had stood for 40 years, a fresh coat of forest green paint gleamed on the narrow shop front. Golden lettering spelled out Blythe's Antique Toy Emporium in elegant script, and the window displayed a treasure trove that would have made Ali Baba himself pause in wonder. "Jane, Jane, my dear." Mrs Dolly Bantry's voice carried across the street with its customary urgency. She hurried over, her silver hair slightly dishevelled, and her cheeks pink with excitement. "Have you seen it? The new shop. Captain Blythe has invited us to a private viewing this afternoon before the grand opening on Saturday. Such a distinguished gentleman, and the most fascinating collection." Miss Marple smiled gently at her old friend's enthusiasm. "How very kind of the captain. I confess I've been rather curious about our new neighbour ever since the removal van arrived last week." "Oh, he's quite the character," Dolly continued, barely pausing for breath. "Retired merchant seaman, you know. Spent 20 years in the Orient and collected the most extraordinary things. He was telling me yesterday about a music box from Vienna that plays Chopin, and a whole regiment of tin soldiers from Germany that march in perfect formation when you wind them up." Miss Marple's keen blue eyes had already been drawn to the shop window, where amid the glittering array of clockwork creatures and painted tin, one particular item caught her attention. An exquisite ballerina music box, clearly from the 1890s, stood poised in graceful arabesque. The craftsmanship was superb, from the dancer's delicate porcelain face to the elaborate golden base decorated with tiny roses and forget-me-nots. "That's a beautiful piece," she murmured, more to herself than to Dolly. "Which one, dear?" "Oh, the ballerina." "Yes, isn't she lovely? Though I notice she seems to be missing her winding key. Perhaps it fell off during the move." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, details that seemed inconsequential often proved to be anything but. Still, she chided herself silently. This was a toy shop, not a crime scene, and she was becoming altogether too suspicious in her old age. At precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, the two ladies presented themselves at the shop door. Captain Horace Blythe himself greeted them with the courteous bearing of a man accustomed to command. He was perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair and weathered hands that spoke of years handling rope and rigging. His dark blue jacket was immaculate, and a small anchor pin adorned his lapel. "Mrs Bantry, Miss Marple, how delightful to see you both." His voice carried the faint trace of a Norfolk accent overlaid with the crisp diction of the merchant navy. "Please, do come in. I do hope you'll find something to interest you in my little collection." Little collection indeed. Miss Marple's first impression was of stepping into a Victorian child's dream made manifest. Every available surface gleamed with painted tin and polished brass. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with mechanical marvels from across Europe. A magnificent German locomotive, easily 2 feet long, dominated one corner, its green paint pristine and its brass fittings gleaming like gold. Nearby, a troop of acrobatic monkeys hung from tiny trapeze bars, their clockwork mechanisms visible through glass panels in their backs. "My word, Captain," Dolly breathed. "However did you manage to acquire such treasures?" Captain Blythe's chest swelled with evident pride. 40 years at sea, Mrs Bantry, and an eye for quality. Every port from Hamburg to Hong Kong, and always with a few pounds to spare for something special. That elephant there," he pointed to a grey tin creature with jewelled howdah, "came from a bazaar in Calcutta. The dancing bears were a parting gift from a Russian collector in St Petersburg." Miss Marple moved slowly through the narrow aisles, her trained eye taking in every detail. The shop was cramped but beautifully organised, with the most valuable pieces displayed in glass cases and the simpler toys arranged on open shelves. A young woman with auburn hair and intelligent brown eyes worked quietly at a table near the back, carefully dusting a collection of tin soldiers. "My niece Lydia," Captain Blythe explained, following Miss Marple's gaze. "My late brother's daughter. She's been invaluable in helping me set up the shop. has quite an eye for restoration work." Lydia Blythe looked up from her work and smiled shyly. She was perhaps 25, with a kind of understated prettiness that improved on closer acquaintance. Her clothes were neat but not fashionable, and her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were stained with a kind of metal polish used on brass and tin. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "Uncle Horace has told me so much about you. I do hope you'll find something to your liking. We have some lovely music boxes that might interest you." "Indeed? I was admiring the ballerina in the window," Miss Marple replied. "Such exquisite workmanship. Viennese, I should think." Captain Blythe's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes, a beauty, isn't she? Though I'm afraid she suffered a bit during the journey. The winding key has gone missing, probably just a victim of the removal men's enthusiasm. Nothing that can't be mended, of course." Miss Marple nodded politely, though she couldn't help wondering why such a valuable piece would be displayed in the window in damaged condition. Perhaps the captain was simply eager to show off his finest pieces regardless of their current state. "Now then," Captain Blythe continued with renewed vigour, "let me show you my pride and joy. This fellow here is quite remarkable." He led them to a glass case near the centre of the shop, where a most unusual automaton held court. The figure was dressed as a French gentleman of the 18th century, complete with powdered wig, silk coat, and silver buttons. His face was carved from wood and painted with remarkable skill, the eyes bright with mischief and the mouth curved in a permanent smile. "Monsieur Farceur," Captain Blythe announced with a flourish, "the laughing automaton, made in Paris around 1780, and one of only 3 known to exist. When wound, he doesn't just laugh, he actually tells jokes. The mechanism is incredibly complex, a masterpiece of clockwork engineering." As if summoned by the captain's words, the shop bell chimed, and a thin, sharp-faced man in an expensive overcoat entered. He moved with the quick, nervous energy of a ferret, his dark eyes immediately scanning the assembled toys with professional interest. "Ah, Mr. Graysmith," Captain Blythe's voice carried a note of wariness. "Ladies, may I present Mr. Felix Graysmith, a dealer from London. He has expressed considerable interest in several of my pieces." Felix Graysmith barely acknowledged the introductions, his attention fixed entirely on Monsieur Farceur. "Blythe, I've had time to consider your little collection, and I'm prepared to make you an offer. 3 figures for the automaton, and that's being generous." The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As I mentioned yesterday, Mr. Graysmith, Monsieur Farceur is not for sale. He's the centrepiece of my collection." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Graysmith replied with an unpleasant smile. "I have clients who would pay handsomely for such a piece, and I'm prepared to share that profit with you." Miss Marple observed the exchange with growing interest. There was clearly more to this conversation than met the eye, and the tension between the 2 men was palpable. "Perhaps," she suggested mildly, "Mr. Graysmith would care to return tomorrow for the official opening? I'm sure Captain Blythe would be delighted to discuss business matters then." Both men turned to her with expressions of surprise, as if they'd forgotten her presence entirely. Captain Blythe recovered first, his natural courtesy reasserting itself. "Miss Marple is quite right, of course. Tomorrow will be soon enough for all that. Now, would you ladies care for some tea? I've just put the kettle on." As they settled into the small parlour behind the shop, Miss Marple found herself wondering about the undercurrent she'd sensed in that brief exchange. In her experience, when men spoke of generous offers and sharing profits, the conversation was rarely as straightforward as it appeared. But perhaps she was reading too much into a simple business disagreement. After all, she reminded herself once again, this was merely a toy shop in St. Mary Mead, not the setting for one of her nephew Raymond's detective novels. Still, as she sipped her tea and listened to Captain Blythe's tales of the Orient, her eyes kept drifting to the window where the beautiful ballerina stood forever frozen in her dance, waiting for someone to find her missing key. Chapter 2. The Automaton That Laughed Once. The sound that shattered the peaceful September night was unlike anything St. Mary Mead had heard in living memory. Sharp, insistent, and utterly foreign to the village's gentle rhythms, the new alarm bell at Blythe's Antique Toy Emporium cut through the darkness like a scream. Miss Marple had been dozing in her chair by the sitting-room fire, a half-finished piece of knitting in her lap, when the clamour began. The sound jolted her awake with the efficiency of a physical blow, and she was on her feet and peering through the lace curtains before she had fully collected her thoughts. Across the high street, the toy shop's windows blazed with electric light, and already she could see figures hurrying along the cobblestones. Mr. Petherick from the post office, still in his nightshirt but with a mackintosh thrown over it, was rattling the shop door. Behind him came Dr. Haydock, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his sparse grey hair wild from sleep. Miss Marple reached for her coat without hesitation. In her considerable experience, when alarm bells rang in the night, they rarely signified anything trivial. By the time she reached the shop, a small crowd had gathered. The Reverend Leonard Clement stood beside his wife, both looking shaken and confused. Mrs. Price from the bakery clutched her dressing gown close against the night chill, while young Ted Bassett from the garage worked at the shop door with what appeared to be a collection of various keys. "No use, I'm afraid," Dr. Haydock was saying as Miss Marple approached. "The door's locked tight, and I can't see anyone moving about inside, though the lights are blazing away." "The alarm's still going," observed Mr. Petherick unnecessarily, raising his voice over the persistent clanging. "Someone ought to find Captain Blythe. He'll have a key, surely." "I've sent young Jimmy to fetch him," said Mrs. Clement. "He lives in those rooms above the draper's shop, doesn't he? At least that's what Mrs. Bantry told me." As if summoned by her words, Captain Blythe appeared at the far end of the street, moving with the swift, economical gait of a man accustomed to emergencies at sea. He was fully dressed despite the hour, and Miss Marple noticed with the automatic precision of long habit that his hair was neatly combed and his shoes properly laced. Either he was a remarkably quick dresser, or he had not yet retired for the night. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, his voice carrying easily over the alarm's clamour. "The bell's connected to the front door and the main display cases. Someone's been at my shop." He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket and worked it in the lock with practised efficiency. The door swung open, and the alarm's shriek doubled in volume as the night air rushed in. "Stay back, all of you," Dr. Haydock ordered with professional authority. "Let me go first." But Captain Blythe was already pushing past him, his face grim with determination. "This is my establishment, Doctor. I'll thank you to remember that." The little group pressed forward in the doorway, and Miss Marple found herself with an excellent view of the scene that met them. At first glance, the shop appeared undisturbed. The carefully arranged displays seemed intact, the glass cases unbroken, the countless mechanical toys still posed in their elaborate tableau. Then Dr. Haydock's sharp intake of breath drew their attention to the centre of the shop, where Monsieur Farceur held court in his glass case. Felix Graysmith was slumped forward over the automaton's display stand, his thin body bent at an unnatural angle. His expensive overcoat had fallen open, revealing a white shirt that was no longer entirely white. A dark stain spread across the fabric, and from his throat protruded what appeared to be a thin blade of steel. "Good God," breathed the Reverend Clement. Dr. Haydock moved forward with professional calm, his fingers seeking the pulse that they all knew he would not find. "Dead," he pronounced after a moment. "And recently, I should say. The body's still warm." Miss Marple's attention, however, had been caught by something else entirely. In the sudden silence that followed the doctor's pronouncement, she could hear a soft, rhythmic ticking from the direction of the automaton. The clockwork mechanism was still running. "Captain Blythe," she said quietly, "how long does the automaton run when fully wound?" The captain turned to her with a distracted expression. "What? Oh, the clockwork. Perhaps 20 minutes. Half an hour at most. The spring's quite delicate, you understand." "And it's still running now?" "Yes, I can hear it." His face was pale in the electric light. "But that's impossible. I always wind down all the mechanisms before closing. It's a matter of routine. Keeps the springs from weakening." "Then someone wound it tonight," Miss Marple observed. "Someone who knew how to operate the mechanism." Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary examination and was studying the weapon with professional interest. "Extraordinary thing," he murmured. "The blade appears to be part of the automaton itself. Some sort of spring-loaded mechanism, I'd say." Miss Marple moved closer, careful not to disturb the scene. The steel blade that had killed Felix Graysmith was indeed part of Monsieur Farceur's construction, a delicate piece of metalwork that normally held the figure's jaw in position. But something had gone wrong with the mechanism, causing the blade to spring outward with deadly force. "An accident, surely," suggested Mr. Petherick hopefully. "The poor fellow must have been examining the automaton and somehow triggered the mechanism." "Possible," Dr. Haydock agreed, though his tone suggested he found the explanation less than satisfactory. "We'll need to wait for Inspector Slack, of course. Someone should telephone the police station." Captain Blythe stepped forward, his face set in grim lines. "I'll ring them myself. This is my responsibility." He paused, looking around at the assembled villagers. "I suppose you'll all want to know what Mr. Graysmith was doing in my shop at this hour." "The thought had occurred to me," Miss Marple said gently. "He came back after you ladies left this afternoon. Quite insistent he was, about viewing the automaton again. Said he had a client who might be interested in a private sale, despite what I'd told him earlier." The captain's voice carried a note of regret. "I agreed to let him examine the piece more closely. We arranged to meet here at 11 o'clock. "And you left him alone with the automaton?" Dr. Haydock asked. "For a few minutes only. I went to fetch some documentation from the back room, certificates of authenticity and such. When I returned..." He gestured helplessly at the scene before them. Miss Marple was studying the glass case with careful attention. The front panel stood open, and she could see that the automaton's key was still in place. Someone had indeed wound the mechanism, and recently. "Captain," she said thoughtfully, "you mentioned yesterday that the ballerina in the window was missing her winding key. I don't suppose you found it since then?" "The key?" He looked puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "No, I'm afraid not, though I can't see what bearing that has on this terrible business." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She was thinking about keys and clockwork mechanisms, about the precise timing required to wind an automaton, and about the faint scent that seemed to hang in the air around Monsieur Farceur. It was elusive, almost familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "Sandalwood," she murmured half to herself. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing, Captain. Just thinking aloud." Inspector Slack arrived 20 minutes later, his uniform hastily thrown on, and his manner suggesting that late-night emergencies were a personal affront. He surveyed the scene with the grim satisfaction of a man who had always suspected that antique toy shops were inherently suspicious establishments. "Right then," he announced, pulling out his notebook. "Clear case of accidental death, I'd say. Man tampers with dangerous mechanism springs back and kills him. Happens all the time with these old contraptions." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "How interesting. I must confess I wasn't aware that clockwork toys were considered particularly hazardous." Inspector Slack shot her a look that suggested he found elderly ladies with opinions equally hazardous. "Common sense, Miss Marple. Fellow wins the spring too tight, something gives way, and Bob's your uncle. Tragic, but there it is." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat diplomatically. "Inspector, I should mention that the blade appears to have been designed as part of the automaton's jaw mechanism. It's not immediately clear how it could have sprung outward with such force." "Faulty construction," Slack replied dismissively. "These foreign toys, you never know what corners they've cut. Captain Blythe, you'll need to provide a complete statement about your arrangements with the deceased, and I'll want a full inventory of the shop in case anything's missing." As the inspector continued his brisk examination of the scene, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the window display. The ballerina stood in her eternal arabesque, beautiful and silent, her missing key a small but persistent puzzle. In her experience, puzzles had a way of connecting to each other in the most unexpected ways. A missing key, a wound spring, a blade that should not have been capable of killing anyone, and the lingering scent of sandalwood in a shop full of tin and painted wood. She thought too of Felix Graysmith's visit that afternoon, his persistent interest in the automaton, and his confident assertion that everything was for sale at the right price. Had he discovered something about Monsieur Farceur that had made him return so urgently? The clockwork had finally run down, and the shop fell silent except for the murmur of official voices and the scratch of Inspector Slack's pencil. But Miss Marple continued to listen, as if the toys themselves might whisper their secrets to anyone patient enough to wait. In the morning she decided she would pay another visit to Blythe's Antique Toy Emporium. There were questions that needed answering, and she had a feeling that the key to them all might be smaller and more obvious than anyone suspected. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notes a missing wind key. The morning sun cast long shadows across the high street as Miss Marple made her way to the toy shop, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm against the cobblestones. The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike in the clear September light, but the constable standing guard outside Blythe's Antique Toy Emporium was evidence enough that the tragedy had been all too real. "Morning, Miss Marple." Constable Pock touched his helmet respectfully. "Inspector Slack's inside if you're wanting to speak with him." "How thoughtful of you, Constable. Yes, I believe I should like a word." She found Inspector Slack in the back room, surrounded by ledgers and papers, his expression one of barely contained irritation. Captain Blythe sat nearby, his usually immaculate appearance somewhat dishevelled, while his niece Lydia worked quietly at her restoration table, though Miss Marple noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she handled a small tin locomotive. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack looked up with the weary resignation of a man who had learned to expect interference in his investigations. I suppose you've come to offer your theories about last night's unfortunate accident. Accident? Miss Marple settled herself carefully in the chair Captain Blythe hastily provided. How very interesting. You've reached that conclusion already. Simple case of carelessness, Slack replied firmly. Mr. Graysmith overwound the mechanism, the spring snapped, and the blade flew out. Tragic, but these things happen with old machinery. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you're quite certain that the mechanism was capable of such violent action. Stands to reason, doesn't it? The blade went clean through the poor fellow's throat. Must have been under considerable tension to do that kind of damage. Indeed. Miss Marple's voice was gently curious. Captain Blythe, I wonder if you might show me how the automaton normally operates. I confess I'm rather fascinated by clockwork mechanisms. Captain Blythe glanced uncertainly at Inspector Slack, who waved a dismissive hand. Can't see the harm in it. Might even be useful to see how the thing's supposed to work. They moved to where Monsieur Farceur still stood in his glass case, though the automaton had been carefully cleaned and the blade mechanism reset. Miss Marple studied the figure with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of embroidery. The key goes here, Captain Blythe explained, indicating a small brass fitting in the automaton's back. You turn it clockwise, perhaps 15 or 20 times, no more. The mechanism is quite delicate. And the blade? It's designed to move the jaw up and down as the figure laughs. Normally it would never extend beyond the mouth cavity. That's what makes last night's accident so unusual. Miss Marple examined the blade mechanism more closely. It was indeed a marvel of 18th century engineering, with tiny gears and springs that controlled the automaton's various movements. But something about it troubled her, though she couldn't quite identify what. Captain, she said suddenly, would you mind very much if I examine the ballerina in the window? I'm still rather curious about that missing key. Of course, though I'm not sure what bearing it has on the present situation. They moved to the window display where the beautiful ballerina stood frozen in her graceful pose. Miss Marple lifted the music box carefully, turning it over to examine the winding mechanism on the base. A lovely piece, she murmured. Swiss, I should think, from the quality of the workmanship, and the key that's missing. About so long, Captain Blythe indicated with his fingers. Brass with a decorative handle, standard size for pieces of this period. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the empty keyhole. Then, with the sudden decisiveness that her friends had learned to recognise, she turned back to Monsieur Farceur. Captain Blythe, she said quietly, I wonder if you would be so kind as to try something for me. Would the ballerina's key fit the automaton's mechanism? The ballerina's key? He looked puzzled. I suppose it might. Keys of that period were often interchangeable, at least for pieces from the same workshop, but what possible relevance? Humour an old woman's curiosity, if you would. Captain Blythe's face had gone very pale, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were no longer quite steady. I'm afraid I don't have the ballerina's key. As I mentioned, it's been missing since the move. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. So you did mention Inspector Slack. I don't suppose your men found any keys when they searched the shop last night. Keys? Slack looked up from his paperwork with annoyance. Plenty of keys. Shops full of the things. Dozens of them for various toys and music boxes. But not perhaps one that would fit both the ballerina and the automaton. There was a long silence. Captain Blythe had seated himself heavily in a chair, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion. Lydia had stopped pretending to work and was watching the conversation with wide, frightened eyes. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack's voice carried a warning note, I hope you're not suggesting that this was anything other than an accident, because if you are, you'll need rather more evidence than a missing music box key. Oh, I quite agree, Miss Marple replied mildly. Evidence is so important, isn't it? Which is why I found it rather curious that last night, when we discovered poor Mr. Graysmith, there was such a strong scent of sandalwood in the air around the automaton. Sandalwood? Captain Blythe's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, most distinctive. Rather unusual, I should have thought, in a shop full of tin and painted wood, unless, of course, someone had been using sandalwood oil for some particular purpose. She moved closer to the automaton, her nose wrinkling slightly. It's still there, you know. Faint, but quite unmistakable. The scent clings to the velvet waistcoat. Inspector Slack had risen from his desk and was studying the automaton with renewed interest. Sandalwood oil, he muttered. What would anyone want with sandalwood oil in a toy shop? An excellent question, Inspector. Perhaps Miss Lydia might enlighten us. You do restoration work, don't you, my dear? All eyes turned to the young woman who had gone very white. Yes, sometimes. For cleaning and polishing. But I don't use sandalwood oil. It's too expensive and not really suitable for tin toys. No, Miss Marple agreed. I shouldn't think it would be. But it might be used by someone who worked with clocks, mightn't it? Someone who needed to lubricate very delicate mechanisms. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Captain Blythe cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but if you're implying that someone deliberately sabotaged the automaton... Oh, I'm not implying anything, Captain. I'm simply noting some rather curious coincidences. A missing key that would fit the murder weapon, a scent that has no business being in a toy shop, and a mechanism that behaved in a most unexpected manner. She paused, studying the assembled faces with the gentle attention of a naturalist observing interesting specimens. You know, in my experience, when a clockwork toy malfunctions so dramatically, it's usually because someone has interfered with the mechanism. Not necessarily with malicious intent, of course. Sometimes people simply don't understand how delicate these old pieces can be. Inspector Slack had pulled out his notebook and was writing rapidly. Right then, Captain Blythe, I'll need you to provide a complete list of everyone who had access to the shop yesterday, and I want to know about anyone who might have had reason to handle that automaton. There was only Mr. Graysmith, Captain Blythe said quietly, and myself, of course, and Lydia was here for most of the afternoon, working on her restoration projects. Anyone else? Think carefully. Captain Blythe was silent for a long moment. Mrs. Hemmings came by around closing time, Drusilla Hemmings, the clock repairer. She sometimes supplies me with spare parts for the mechanical toys. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Hemmings. She would certainly know about clockwork mechanisms, wouldn't she? And she might very well use sandalwood oil in her work. Now see here, Inspector Slack interrupted. You can't go about accusing people based on the smell of furniture polish. Of course not, Inspector. Though I believe sandalwood oil is rather more expensive than ordinary furniture polish. One might almost call it a luxury. She turned back to the automaton, her expression thoughtful. I wonder, Captain, whether you've given any thought to how someone might have gained access to the shop after hours. The alarm system you installed seems quite sophisticated. The alarm only covers the doors and the main display cases, Captain Blythe replied reluctantly. Someone with a key could have entered without triggering it, as long as they were careful about which cases they opened. And who, besides yourself, has keys to the shop? Only Lydia. She's been helping me with the setup, and she often works late on her restoration projects. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. And the arrangement to meet Mr. Graysmith at 11 o'clock. Was that made publicly, or was it a private matter? Private, certainly, though I suppose anyone might have overheard us talking yesterday afternoon. We weren't exactly whispering. No, I don't suppose you were. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost absent-minded. These old buildings, they do carry sound so remarkably. One can often hear conversations from quite surprising distances. She moved to the window, gazing out at the familiar street scene. Inspector Slack. I wonder if you might consider having the automaton examined by an expert. Someone who understands clockwork mechanisms intimately. An expert? Slack looked sceptical. What sort of expert? A clock repairer, perhaps. Someone who might be able to tell us whether the mechanism had been tampered with, and if so, how? Inspector Slack made another note. I suppose it couldn't hurt, though I still say it was an accident. These old toys, they're death traps waiting to happen. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps you're right, Inspector, but I do think it would be wise to speak with Mrs. Hemmings, don't you? If only to eliminate her from your inquiries. As they prepared to leave the shop, Miss Marple paused for one final look at the ballerina in the window. The beautiful figure seemed to dance in the morning light, forever poised between movements, waiting for someone to wind her key and bring her music to life. Such a pity about the missing key, she murmured to herself. I do hope it turns up soon. Music boxes are so much more interesting when they can actually play their tunes. Chapter 4, Tin Soldiers and Brass Gears. By tea time that afternoon, Inspector Slack had compiled what he considered a most unsatisfactory list of persons who might conceivably have had both motive and opportunity to interfere with Monsieur Farceur's delicate mechanism. Miss Marple, invited to review the particulars over tea and seed cake in Mrs. Bantry's sitting room, found herself rather more intrigued by the human elements of the case than by its mechanical aspects. 5 possible suspects, Dolly Bantry announced with the relish of one who had spent the morning collecting gossip from every available source. Though I must say, Jane, it seems rather excessive for such a small village. Miss Marple accepted her second cup of tea with a gentle smile. Human nature is much the same everywhere, my dear. People have been killing each other over money and pride since Cain and Abel, and I don't suppose St. Mary Mead is any exception. Well then, Dolly settled back in her chair with evident satisfaction. Captain Blythe himself, naturally. He discovered the body, which always looks suspicious, doesn't it? And he did have rather strong words with that horrid Graysmith man yesterday. Motives, however, do seem rather mixed in the captain's case, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. A scandal of this sort could hardly be good for business, particularly just before the grand opening. True, but Inspector Slack seems to think there might have been some sort of financial arrangement between them. Something about sharing profits from private sales. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed? How very interesting. And who else has attracted the inspector's attention? Lydia Blythe, the niece. She had keys to the shop, knows how all the mechanisms work, and apparently she's been having rather grand ideas about modernising the business. Wants to turn it into some sort of fashionable boutique, according to Mrs. Price from the bakery. Young people often have ambitious plans, Miss Marple said mildly. Though I noticed yesterday that Miss Lydia seemed genuinely fond of the restoration work. Not everyone who appreciates old things wants to throw them away for something new. Dolly consulted the notes she had scribbled on the back of an envelope. Then there's Freddie Scales, the carpenter who's been building display cases for the shop. Apparently Captain Blythe owes him rather a lot of money for work already completed, and there was quite a row about it yesterday evening. After the shop closed, so Mrs. Clement heard. She was walking past around 6:30 and heard raised voices coming from inside. Freddie was demanding payment, and the captain was telling him he'd have to wait until after the opening weekend. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Financial difficulties do make people desperate sometimes, and a carpenter would certainly know how to work with delicate mechanisms. Next we have Drusilla Hemmings, the clock repairer you mentioned this morning. She supplies spare parts for the mechanical toys, and she was definitely in the shop yesterday around closing time. Yes, I remember Captain Blythe mentioning her visit. Did Inspector Slack manage to speak with her? He did indeed, and apparently she was most cooperative. Admitted readily that she uses sandalwood oil in her work, said it's the best thing for lubricating very fine clock mechanisms, but she swears she never went near the automaton, only delivered some replacement springs for a German locomotive. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And yet the scent was definitely present around Monsieur Farceur. Most curious. The last suspect is rather more mysterious, Dolly continued with evident relish. A man called Stephen March, who apparently had some sort of business dispute with Graysmith. Inspector Slack tracked him down to the Bentinck Arms, where he's been staying for the past week. What sort of dispute? Something about a collection of tin soldiers that Graysmith supposedly authenticated as genuine antiques. March claims he paid a considerable sum for them, only to discover later that they were clever reproductions. He's been trying to track Graysmith down for months, demanding his money back. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a thoughtful expression. How very unpleasant for Mr. March. And he's been in the village for a week, you said? According to the landlord at the Bentinck Arms, yes. Arrived last Tuesday, paid in advance, and has been asking questions about the new toy shop ever since. Questions? About the owner, the stock, whether there were any particularly valuable pieces, the sort of questions that might suggest more than casual interest. Miss Marple was quiet for several minutes, her fingers absently working at the knitting in her lap. Finally she looked up with the decisive air that Dolly had learned to recognise. I think, she said gently, that I should very much like to meet Mr. Stephen March, and perhaps it would be wise to have another look at that automaton as well. They found Stephen March in the public bar of the Bentinck Arms, nursing a pint of bitter and studying a collection of papers spread out on the scarred oak table. He was a man of perhaps 40, with the pale complexion and slightly stooped shoulders of someone who spent too much time indoors. His clothes were good quality but showed signs of wear, and his hands, Miss Marple noticed, were stained with ink as if he spent considerable time writing. Mr. March, Miss Marple approached with the diffident manner she had perfected over the years. I wonder if you might spare a few minutes to speak with me. I'm Miss Marple, and I live here in the village. March looked up with the wary expression of a man who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected approaches. I've already spoken to the police about last night's business. I don't know what more I can tell you. Oh, I'm not here about last night exactly. I'm more interested in your difficulties with Mr. Graysmith. Such an unpleasant situation when one discovers that valuable items are not what they appear to be. Something in her tone seemed to reassure him, and he gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sit down then, if you like, though I warn you, it's not a pleasant story. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that the best way to encourage confidences was simply to listen. Graysmith approached me 6 months ago, March began, his voice bitter with remembered anger. Said he had acquired a remarkable set of Nuremberg tin soldiers, circa 1860, in absolutely pristine condition. Showed me photographs, certificates of authenticity, the whole business. And you were interested in acquiring them? More than interested. I've been collecting military miniatures for 20 years, and a set like that. Well, it would have been the crown jewel of my collection, worth several £1,000s if genuine. But they weren't genuine? March's laugh held no humour whatsoever. Oh, they were old enough, I'll give them that. But they'd been completely restored with modern paint and fittings, then artificially aged to look original. Clever work, I'll admit, but not worth a tenth of what I paid. How did you discover the deception? I had them examined by an expert in London. Fellow took one look and spotted the telltale signs immediately. Modern paint under ultraviolet light, machine-made screws that weren't invented until 1920, that sort of thing. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And Mr. Graysmith refused to make good the loss. Claimed he'd been deceived himself, said he'd bought them in good faith from a private collector. Offered to split the loss with me, which was hardly satisfactory considering I'd paid the full purchase price. So you came to St. Mary Mead to confront him? March's expression darkened. I'd heard through the collecting community that he was planning to attend the opening of this new toy shop. Thought it might be my last chance to recover something from the mess. And did you speak with him yesterday? Briefly. He was coming out of the shop around 6 o'clock and I managed to corner him outside. Same old story, I'm afraid. Claimed he was working on recovering the money, asked for more time, promised to contact me within the week. Miss Marple studied his face carefully. You must have been very frustrated. Frustrated enough to follow him back to his hotel and have another go at him around 10 o'clock, but the desk clerk said he'd gone out again. Some business appointment or other. And you didn't see him after that? No, though I waited in the hotel lobby until nearly midnight, hoping to catch him when he returned. March gathered up his papers with jerky, angry movements. Not that it matters now, I suppose. Dead men can't pay their debts. As they walked back toward the high street, Miss Marple found herself considering the various threads of motive and opportunity that Inspector Slack had so carefully catalogued. Financial desperation, wounded pride, professional jealousy, and family tensions, all woven around a clockwork automaton that had somehow become a weapon. Dolly, she said suddenly, I think it would be very instructive to have another look at Captain Blythe's shop ledgers. Sometimes the most important clues are hiding in plain sight. The ledgers? But surely Inspector Slack has already examined those. Oh yes, I'm sure he has. But policemen and old ladies sometimes notice different things, don't you think? Chapter 5. A Cracked Music Box Lullaby. The inquest into the death of Felix Graysmith was held 3 days later in the village hall, a modest proceeding that nevertheless drew every resident of St. Mary Mead who could possibly justify their attendance. Miss Marple arrived early, securing a seat in the second row where she could observe both the proceedings and the assembled witnesses with equal clarity. Dr. Haydock, giving his medical evidence with professional precision, confirmed that death had been instantaneous, caused by a steel blade penetrating the carotid artery. The weapon itself had been identified as part of the automaton's jaw mechanism, a delicate piece of 18th century engineering that had somehow malfunctioned with fatal consequences. In your professional opinion, the coroner inquired, could such an injury have been accidental? Dr. Haydock paused thoughtfully. The force required would have been considerable. The blade penetrated approximately 3 inches into the victim's neck. Either the spring mechanism was under extraordinary tension or some external force was applied. Miss Marple noted that Captain Blythe shifted uncomfortably in his seat at this observation, while his niece Lydia sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Inspector Slack, when called upon, presented his theory with the confidence of a man who had no doubt about the facts. "Clear case of accidental death, sir. The deceased was examining the automaton, overwound the mechanism, and the resulting spring failure caused the blade to fly out with lethal force." "And you found no evidence of deliberate interference with the mechanism?" "None whatsoever. The automaton had been recently cleaned and serviced, but there were no signs of tampering or sabotage." The coroner made careful notes. "I understand there was some business dispute between the deceased and other parties. Did this suggest any alternative explanation for his death?" "We investigated all possibilities thoroughly," Slack replied firmly. "While it's true that Mr. Graysmith had made enemies in the course of his business dealings, there was no evidence that any of them had opportunity to interfere with the automaton." Miss Marple found this statement rather more definitive than the facts seemed to warrant, but she kept her observations to herself for the moment. Captain Blythe was called next, his weathered face grave as he recounted the events of that Tuesday evening. His testimony was straightforward enough, confirming that he had arranged to meet Graysmith at 11 o'clock to discuss the possible sale of the automaton. "You left the deceased alone with the mechanism?" the coroner asked. "For perhaps 10 minutes. I went to the back room to fetch some documentation. When I returned, I found him as you've heard described." "And the automaton was still functioning at that time?" "Yes, the clockwork was running. It continued for perhaps another 15 minutes before winding down." The coroner consulted his notes. "I understand that this particular automaton requires a specific key to operate. Was this key in place when you discovered the body?" Captain Blythe hesitated for just a moment. "Yes, sir. The key was in position." "And this key, I'm told, might fit other pieces in your collection?" "Possibly. Keys of that period were often interchangeable, particularly for pieces from the same workshop." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpened by something in the captain's tone. There was a quality to his responses that suggested careful preparation, as if he had rehearsed his answers to anticipated questions. The coroner turned to more technical matters. "I believe we have an expert witness who has examined the automaton's mechanism." Mrs. Drusilla Hemmings rose from her seat in the third row, a small bird-like woman with shrewd dark eyes and hands permanently stained with clock oil. She moved to the witness chair with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being consulted on matters of mechanical complexity. "Mrs. Hemmings," the coroner began, "you're a qualified clock and automaton repairer." "For 37 years, sir, trained by my late husband, who learned the trade from his father before him." "And you've examined the automaton in question?" "I have indeed. A remarkable piece of work, French manufacture circa 1780. The mechanism is extraordinarily complex, with multiple springs controlling various movements. In your expert opinion, could this mechanism have malfunctioned in the manner described?" Mrs. Hemmings was quiet for a long moment, her weathered fingers working at the clasp of her handbag. "It's possible," she said finally, "but highly unlikely. The blade mechanism is designed with multiple safety features to prevent exactly this sort of accident." Miss Marple noticed that Inspector Slack's expression had grown somewhat less confident. "Could the mechanism have been deliberately altered?" the coroner pressed. "Someone with sufficient knowledge could certainly have modified the spring tension or disabled the safety mechanisms. It would require considerable expertise, but it could be done." "And would such modifications be detectable?" "Difficult to say. If the person knew what they were doing, they might leave very little trace." The coroner made additional notes before dismissing Mrs. Hemmings. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that the clock repairer acknowledged with the faintest of smiles. The final witness was Lydia Blythe, who gave her evidence in a voice so quiet that the coroner had to ask her twice to speak up. Her account corroborated her uncle's testimony, confirming that she had left the shop at approximately 6 o'clock and had not returned until the following morning. "Miss Blythe," the coroner said gently, "I understand you work with the restoration of mechanical toys. Did you have any occasion to examine the automaton before Mr. Graysmith's death?" "Only briefly. Uncle Horace asked me to dust it when we first set up the display case, but I didn't wind it or test the mechanism." "And you noticed nothing unusual about its condition?" Lydia shook her head. It seemed in perfect working order. As the formal proceedings concluded, the coroner delivered his verdict with the measured tones of a man who had learned to be cautious about matters that seemed too neat and simple. "While the evidence suggests that Mr. Graysmith's death was the result of a mechanical failure, I am not entirely satisfied that all possibilities have been explored. I therefore return an open verdict, pending any further evidence that might come to light. Inspector Slack's face showed his displeasure at this decision, while Miss Marple found herself rather more intrigued than disappointed. As the crowd dispersed, she approached Captain Blythe, who was speaking in low tones with his niece near the hall's entrance. "Captain," she said gently, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity once more. I should very much like to hear the ballerina music box play. You mentioned yesterday that you thought you might have located a suitable replacement key." Captain Blythe's face went pale. "A replacement key? I'm afraid I don't recall mentioning any such thing." "Perhaps I misunderstood," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though I could have sworn you said something about having the piece properly restored for the reopening." "Uncle," Lydia said quietly, "we do have that spare key that Mrs. Hemmings brought yesterday, the one from the German clock she was repairing." Captain Blythe shot his niece a look that Miss Marple found most illuminating. "Yes, of course, though I'm not certain it would fit properly." "Perhaps we might try it," Miss Marple suggested. "I should so enjoy hearing the tune." They returned to the shop where the ballerina still stood in her eternal pose. Captain Blythe produced a small brass key with evident reluctance, fitting it into the mechanism on the base of the music box. "Chopin's Minute Waltz," he explained as he began to wind the spring. "A beautiful piece, though the cylinder is quite old and may not play perfectly." The first notes emerged sweet and clear, the ballerina beginning her graceful rotation. But as the melody progressed, Miss Marple's trained ear detected something wrong. The tune faltered on the final bar, the notes becoming distorted and mechanical, before settling into a rhythmic clicking like a metronome counting time. "How curious," she murmured, examining the base of the music box more closely. In the bright afternoon light, she could see a hairline crack running across the brass cylinder, and around the crack, a thin smear of what appeared to be resin cement. "It seems the mechanism has been repaired recently," she observed. "How very thoughtful of someone to mend it so carefully." Captain Blythe was staring at the music box with an expression of growing horror, while Lydia had gone very white. "Uncle," the young woman whispered, "what have you done?" Miss Marple straightened slowly, her gentle blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. "I think," she said quietly, "that it's time we had a proper conversation about what really happened on Tuesday night. Chapter 6, Footprints in the Sawdust." The silence that followed Miss Marple's gentle suggestion stretched uncomfortably through the shop, broken only by the faint ticking of various clockwork mechanisms and the distant sound of village life continuing its normal course outside. Captain Blythe stood frozen beside the still clicking music box, his weathered face a study in conflicting emotions, while Lydia pressed her hands to her mouth as if to prevent any inadvertent words from escaping. "I think," Miss Marple continued in her most soothing tone, "that we might all benefit from a cup of tea while we discuss this matter. These things are always easier to sort out in a civilized atmosphere." Before either of the Blythes could respond, the shop door opened with its familiar chime, and Inspector Slack entered with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent the morning reconsidering his conclusions. "Captain Blythe," he announced without preamble, "I've decided to conduct a more thorough examination of the premises. The coroner's verdict has made it necessary to explore all possibilities." His sharp eyes took in the scene before him, the still-running music box, the pale faces of the shop's occupants, and Miss Marple's expression of polite interest. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. I don't suppose you've been interfering with my crime scene. Merely satisfying an old woman's curiosity about music boxes, Inspector. Though I must say, this particular piece has revealed some rather interesting characteristics." Inspector Slack approached the ballerina with professional caution. The mechanism had finally wound down, leaving the dancer poised in mid-turn, but the hairline crack in the cylinder was clearly visible in the afternoon light. "Recent repair work," he observed grimly, "and not mentioned in any of the statements I've taken. Captain Blythe, would you care to explain why you failed to inform me that this piece had been damaged?" Captain Blythe cleared his throat with evident difficulty. It seemed irrelevant to the matter at hand. The damage occurred during the move, and my niece made temporary repairs. I saw no reason to complicate the investigation with minor details about damaged stock. "Minor details," Inspector Slack repeated with dangerous quiet. "Captain, in a murder investigation there are no minor details. Everything is relevant until proven otherwise." "Murder investigation," Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. "But surely the coroner said it was an accident." "The coroner said no such thing, miss. He returned an open verdict, which means the investigation continues until we have satisfactory answers to all our questions. Miss Marple had moved away from the music box and was examining the shop floor with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of needlework. The wooden boards were covered with a fine layer of sawdust, presumably from Freddie Scale's carpentry work, but the afternoon light revealed patterns in the dust that spoke of recent foot traffic. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe you mentioned yesterday that you intended to examine the floor for evidence of disturbance." "I did indeed. Sergeant Lake was supposed to sweep for footprints last night, but the preliminary examination didn't reveal anything significant. Perhaps a more careful look might prove instructive." Inspector Slack joined her in studying the floor, his trained eye quickly picking out the details that Miss Marple had already noted. Near the counter, 2 distinct sets of footprints were clearly visible in the fresh yellow sawdust. Heavy, hobnailed boots that could only belong to Freddie Scales, and smaller impressions made by a woman's heeled shoes. "The carpenter's prints are easily explained," Slack muttered, tracing the path of the heavy boots. "He was working here on Monday, installing display cases. But these others..." The lighter footprints told a more complex story. They approached the area where Monsieur Farceur stood in his glass case, paused there for some time, then retreated not toward the front door, but toward the back room and stock area. "Miss Lydia," Inspector Slack's voice carried a new note of authority, "I believe these smaller prints are yours. Would you care to explain what you were doing near the automaton after the shop was supposedly closed for the evening?" Lydia Blythe had gone very white, but her voice remained steady. "I came back after dinner to finish some work on a locomotive restoration. I often work late when I have delicate projects to complete." "And you approached the automaton, why?" I thought I heard something, a ticking sound. I wanted to make certain that all the mechanisms had been properly wound down for the night." Miss Marple studied the young woman's face with gentle sympathy. "But you didn't use the front door, did you, my dear? These prints suggest you came from the back of the shop." "I have a key to the rear entrance. Uncle Horace gave it to me when I started helping with the restoration work. It's more convenient when I'm carrying tools and supplies." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. "What time was this?" "Around 9:30, I think. Perhaps a bit later." "And you found the automaton in what condition?" Lydia hesitated, glancing toward her uncle with an expression that Miss Marple found most revealing. "It seemed different somehow. Not quite in the same position as when I'd dusted it earlier." "Different how?" "The key was in place, which struck me as odd. Uncle Horace is very particular about removing all the keys when the shop closes. He says it prevents accidents and reduces wear on the mechanisms." Captain Blythe's face had taken on a greyish pallor. "Lydia, I think perhaps you should say no more without..." "Without what, Captain?" Inspector Slack's voice was sharp. "Without legal representation? That's an interesting suggestion for someone who's been maintaining this was all a tragic accident." Miss Marple moved closer to the display case where Monsieur Farceur stood in silent splendour. The automaton had been cleaned since Tuesday night, but she could still detect the faint, telltale scent of sandalwood that had first caught her attention. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if you've given any thought to the sequence of events that led to Mr. Graysmith's death. The precise timing seems rather important." "How do you mean?" "Well, if the automaton was wound and left running on Tuesday evening, and if Mr. Graysmith discovered it in that condition when he arrived at 11 o'clock, why didn't the mechanism run down before he had a chance to interfere with it?" Inspector Slack frowned, clearly working through the implications. "You're suggesting someone wound it deliberately, knowing that Graysmith would find it running?" "I'm suggesting that clockwork mechanisms are quite predictable in their behaviour. If one knows precisely how long a particular spring will run, one could time events quite carefully." She turned to Captain Blythe with the gentle expression that masked a razor-sharp intellect. "You mentioned that Monsieur Farceur runs for 20 to 30 minutes when fully wound. If someone wound the mechanism at, say, 10:30, it would still be running when Mr. Graysmith arrived at 11, wouldn't it?" "I suppose it might," Captain Blythe replied reluctantly, "though I can't see the relevance of such speculation." "Can't you?" Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "Then perhaps you might explain why the ballerina's music box was damaged, why it was hastily repaired with resin cement, and why that same resin appears to have been used on other mechanisms in your shop." She moved to a nearby display case containing a collection of tin soldiers. "These pieces, for instance, several of them show signs of recent restoration work, yet your stock ledger lists them as original, unrestored antiques." Inspector Slack had pulled out his notebook again and was writing furiously. Captain Blythe, I'm beginning to think we need to have a much more detailed conversation about your business practices and your relationship with the deceased." "There's no need for any of this," Lydia said suddenly, her voice stronger now despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. "I can explain everything, if you'll just let me." "Lydia? No!" Captain Blythe's voice carried the authority of long naval command. "You don't understand the implications." "I understand perfectly well, Uncle. I understand that you've been trying to protect me, and I understand that Mr. Graysmith threatened to expose our arrangement unless you gave him a larger share of the profits." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The arrangement being the sale of restored pieces as original antiques." "It started innocently enough," Lydia continued, ignoring her uncle's attempts to silence her. "We found that buyers were willing to pay much higher prices for pieces that appeared to be in original condition, so we began doing more comprehensive restorations, using original parts where possible and creating convincing reproductions where necessary. Yes, Uncle Horace has connections throughout the collecting world, and Mr. Graysmith helped authenticate pieces for clients who didn't examine them too closely." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with grim satisfaction. "So when Graysmith threatened to expose this fraud, unless he received a larger cut of the profits, someone decided to silence him permanently." "But not Lydia," Miss Marple said firmly. "The footprints tell us she discovered something amiss and retreated to the back room. She didn't approach the front door at all." She turned to Captain Blythe with an expression of infinite sadness. "It was you, wasn't it, Captain? You wound the automaton, knowing that Mr. Graysmith's curiosity about its mechanism would prove fatal, and you used the ballerina's key to do it, which is why that piece had to be hastily repaired when the key was damaged in the process." Captain Blythe stood very still for a long moment, his shoulders sagging as if under the weight of years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the dignity of a man who had spent his life accepting responsibility for his actions. "Inspector Slack," he said quietly, "I believe you'll find that I have a statement to make." Chapter 7. Midnight Parcels at the Wayside Station. Before Captain Blythe could elaborate on his promised statement, the shop door chimed once more, admitting Sergeant Lake with the brisk efficiency of a man bearing important news. His usually placid countenance showed signs of excitement barely contained by professional decorum. "Inspector," he announced without preamble, "I think you'd better hear what I've discovered about those midnight activities at the old parcels office." Inspector Slack looked up from his notebook with evident irritation. "Sergeant, we're in the middle of taking a statement that may resolve this entire matter, unless your discovery relates directly to Tuesday night's events." "I believe it does, sir, most directly indeed." Miss Marple found herself intrigued by the sergeant's obvious conviction. In her experience, Sergeant Lake was not given to dramatic pronouncements, unless he had excellent reason for them. "Very well," Inspector Slack conceded with poor grace, "but make it brief." Sergeant Lake consulted his own notebook with the careful precision of a man who had learned never to trust his memory in matters of importance. "Acting on Miss Marple's suggestion yesterday, I've been keeping watch on the disused parcels office at the old railway station. Seemed a likely spot for anyone wanting to move items without attracting attention. And last night, around midnight, I observed two individuals meeting at the location. Miss Lydia Blythe and Mr. Stephen March, the gentleman staying at the Bentinck Arms." The colour drained from Lydia's face, while Captain Blythe's expression shifted from resignation to alarm. Miss Marple noted these reactions with the careful attention of a naturalist, observing particularly interesting specimens. "Miss Blythe was carrying a brown leather trunk," Sergeant Lake continued, "which she handed over to Mr. March. The transaction took perhaps 10 minutes, during which they appeared to be engaged in earnest conversation." "Did you apprehend them?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I thought it best to observe and follow, sir." Mr. March took the trunk to his room at the Bentinck Arms, while Miss Blythe returned home. This morning, armed with a proper warrant, I searched Mr. March's quarters. He produced a key from his pocket with an air of quiet triumph. Among other items, I found this in the trunk, a brass key that I believe will prove most significant to our investigation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the key's construction. It was indeed brass, with the ornate handle typical of late 19th century clockwork mechanisms, and it appeared to be in excellent condition despite its obvious age. "The ballerina's missing key," she murmured with satisfaction. "So it would appear," Sergeant Lake agreed, "along with various clockwork gears, spare parts, and what looked to be duplicate heads for tin soldiers. all items that might be used to restore damaged antiques to apparently original condition. Inspector Slack turned to Lydia with renewed interest. Miss Blythe, I think you have some explaining to do. What was your business with Mr. March, and why were you conducting it in secret at such an unusual hour? Lydia glanced toward her uncle, who nodded slowly with the weary resignation of a man who had finally accepted the inevitable. Stephen approached me 3 days ago, she said quietly. He knew about our restoration business from his dealings with Mr. Graysmith. He offered to help us expose the fraud in exchange for evidence that would support his legal claim against Graysmith's estate. What sort of evidence? Documentation of which pieces had been extensively restored, proof that Graysmith knew they were being sold as original antiques, correspondence about profit-sharing arrangements, all the material that would demonstrate the scope of the deception. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face with gentle sympathy. But that wasn't your only concern, was it, my dear? You were also trying to protect your uncle from the consequences of the business arrangement. I thought if I could remove the most obviously problematic pieces before the grand opening, we might be able to rebuild the business on a more honest foundation. The trunk contained items that would have exposed us immediately to anyone with real expertise, including the ballerina's key. Lydia nodded miserably. I found it Tuesday evening when I came back to work on the locomotive restoration. It was lying on the floor near the automaton's case, and I knew immediately what it meant. Inspector Slack looked between the various participants with growing impatience. Would someone please explain the significance of this key? We seem to be talking around the subject rather than addressing it directly. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window display where the ballerina stood in her eternal pose. Inspector, the significance lies in the fact that keys from this period were often interchangeable between pieces from the same workshop. The ballerina's key would fit Monsieur Farceur perfectly. And if someone used that key to wind the automaton on Tuesday night, knowing that Mr. Graysmith would be curious enough to examine a running mechanism, they could have predicted the fatal result with considerable accuracy. She turned back to the assembled group, her expression grave. The question is, who had access to the key? Who knew about the automaton's lethal potential, and who had sufficient motive to risk murder? Captain Blythe stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Inspector Slack, I believe I made it clear that I have a statement to make about Tuesday night's events. Perhaps we might proceed with that before pursuing these other matters. In due course, Captain. First, I want to understand exactly what Miss Blythe and Mr. March were planning, and whether their activities have any bearing on Graysmith's death. Sergeant Lake cleared his throat diplomatically. If I might suggest, sir, Mr. March is currently waiting at the station. He came voluntarily when I explained that we needed to clarify certain matters. He seems quite eager to cooperate. Does he indeed? And what's his explanation for this midnight transaction? Claims he was helping Miss Blythe document evidence of fraud for potential legal proceedings. Says he never intended to profit from the arrangement, only to recover what he'd lost in his dealings with Graysmith. Miss Marple found herself considering the various threads of motive and opportunity that had emerged over the past few days. Inspector, might I suggest that Mr. March's involvement, while certainly relevant to the broader question of fraud, may not be directly connected to the murder itself? How do you mean? Well, if Miss Lydia discovered the key on Tuesday evening and didn't hand it over to Mr. March until Wednesday night, then the key was available to someone else during the crucial period when Mr. Graysmith was killed. Inspector Slack made another note. Someone who knew where to find it and how to use it. Precisely. Someone who understood clockwork mechanisms intimately, who had access to the shop, and who knew about Mr. Graysmith's appointment at 11 o'clock. She paused, studying Captain Blythe's increasingly pale complexion. Someone who might have used sandalwood oil to lubricate the automaton's mechanism, ensuring it would function smoothly when wound. Sandalwood oil? Sergeant Lake looked puzzled. But Mrs. Hemmings said she uses that in her clock repair work. Indeed she does. But Mrs. Hemmings wasn't in the shop on Tuesday evening, was she? She delivered her spare parts earlier in the day and left without going near the automaton. Miss Marple moved closer to Monsieur Farceur, her nose wrinkling slightly at the faint but persistent scent that still clung to the figure's velvet waistcoat. Captain Blythe, she said gently, I believe you purchased a small quantity of sandalwood oil from Mrs. Hemmings last week, didn't you? For use in maintaining the more delicate mechanisms in your collection. Captain Blythe's shoulders sagged as if under a tremendous weight. How did you know about that? Because, my dear Captain, you have the habits of a careful seaman. You would naturally want to maintain your valuable pieces in perfect condition, and you would seek expert advice about the proper lubricants to use. Inspector Slack had stopped writing and was watching this exchange with growing interest. Captain, I think it's time you told us exactly what happened on Tuesday night. Yes, Captain Blythe said quietly. I rather think it is. He moved to a chair near the counter and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. Inspector Slack, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to confess to the deliberate murder of Felix Graysmith. The words fell into the shop like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that seemed to touch every corner of the cramped space. Uncle, no! Lydia's cry was anguished. You don't understand what you're saying. On the contrary, my dear, Captain Blythe replied with infinite sadness. I understand perfectly, and it's time the truth was told. Chapter 8. The Toymaker's Ledger of Lies. Captain Blythe's confession hung in the air like smoke from a cannon, but Miss Marple found herself studying the man's face with the careful attention of someone who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between truth and noble falsehood. There was something in his expression, a quality of desperate protection rather than genuine guilt, that made her wonder if the full story had yet been told. Uncle, please, Lydia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. You mustn't do this. You don't understand what you're sacrificing. I understand perfectly well, my dear girl. I'm an old man who's made a mess of things, and it's time I face the consequences. Inspector Slack had his notebook ready, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Captain, before you proceed with your statement, might I ask you to clarify one small detail? You mentioned that you discovered the body when you returned from fetching documentation. Might we see these papers? They could be most illuminating. Captain Blythe's eyes flickered with something that might have been relief or apprehension. The papers? Yes, of course. They're in the back room. He led them through the narrow doorway behind the counter, where Lydia's restoration workspace occupied most of the available floor. Neat shelves lined the walls, filled with spare parts, tools, and bottles of various oils and cleaning solutions. On a small desk near the window sat a collection of ledgers and files. These are the authentication documents for Monsieur Farceur, Captain Blythe explained, indicating a folder bound with red ribbon. Graysmith wanted to examine them before making his final offer. Miss Marple accepted the folder with polite interest, but her attention was drawn to something else entirely. On the desk, partially concealed beneath other papers, lay an open ledger written in the captain's distinctive hand. The entries were meticulously recorded in the precise script of a man accustomed to keeping ship's logs. Your stock register, Captain. Yes, though I'm not sure what relevance it has to the matter at hand. Miss Marple began turning the pages with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that details often revealed more than dramatic confessions. Each entry was dated and described with maritime precision. German locomotive, circa 1895, original paint and fittings, acquired Hamburg, September 1962. But as she progressed through the ledger, certain discrepancies began to emerge. Items listed as original condition showed subtle inconsistencies in their descriptions, while others bore notations in a different hand, presumably Lydia's, that seemed to contradict the official entries. Captain, she said thoughtfully, I noticed that many of your pieces are described as being in remarkably pristine condition for their age, quite unusual for mechanical toys that are nearly a century old. I've always been careful about the condition of items I acquire. A lifetime at sea teaches a man to recognise quality. Indeed, but I also noticed that your handwriting appears in two distinct styles throughout this ledger. The earlier entries have the character of ship's log notations, while the later ones seem more commercial in their emphasis. Inspector Slack looked up from his own examination of the documents. What are you getting at, Miss Marple? I'm wondering whether this ledger might tell us more about the scope of the restoration business than Captain Blythe's confession suggests. She turned to a page near the back of the book, where the entries became increasingly detailed. Here, for instance, French automaton, Monsieur Farceur, authenticated by F. Graysmith as original 1780 manufacture, mechanism restored to working condition by L. Blythe, sandalwood oil treatment applied to ensure smooth operation. Captain Blythe had gone very pale. Those are simply maintenance notes. Are they? Because this entry is dated last Monday, the day before Mr. Graysmith's death, and it specifically mentions sandalwood oil treatment, which you've told us you purchased from Mrs. Hemmings. Lydia stepped forward, her face set with sudden determination. Miss Marple, you don't understand. Uncle Horace is trying to protect me because he thinks I'm responsible for what happened to Mr. Graysmith. And are you? Not in the way he fears. Lydia's voice grew stronger as she continued. Yes, I discovered that Uncle Horace had been enhancing the provenance of certain pieces to increase their value. Yes, I helped with restorations that were more extensive than we originally disclosed to buyers. And yes, I found the ballerina's key on Tuesday evening and realised what it meant. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. What did it mean to you, my dear? That someone had used it to wind the automaton, knowing that Mr. Graysmith would be unable to resist examining a running mechanism. But I thought... She glanced toward her uncle with obvious anguish. I thought Uncle Horace had done it to protect our secret. And so you decided to remove the evidence. I planned to replace the most obviously problematic pieces with genuine antiques, using the money Stephen March promised to pay for documentation of the fraud. I thought, if I could eliminate the worst examples before anyone else discovered them, we might be able to rebuild the business honestly. Inspector Slack had been following this conversation with growing confusion. But if you both thought the other was responsible for Graysmith's death, and you were both trying to protect each other, then who actually killed him? Miss Marple closed the ledger with a decisive snap. I think, Inspector, that we need to examine this case from an entirely different perspective. We've been assuming that the murderer was someone who knew about the fraud and killed to protect it. But what if the motive was quite different? How do you mean? What if someone killed Mr. Graysmith not to conceal the fraud, but to expose it? She moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful village street. Consider the evidence from this viewpoint. Someone with intimate knowledge of clockwork mechanisms deliberately sabotaged the automaton, knowing that Graysmith's death would inevitably lead to a thorough investigation of the shop and its contents. But who would want to expose the fraud? Graysmith was profiting from it himself. Exactly, Inspector. Which means our murderer wasn't someone who was part of the conspiracy, but someone who had discovered it and wanted to ensure it was brought to light. Miss Marple turned back to the group, her expression grave. Someone who'd been deceived by the conspiracy and sought not just personal revenge but public justice. Stephen March, Inspector Slack said suddenly. He had every reason to want Graysmith exposed. Mr. March certainly had motive, Miss Marple agreed, but I don't believe he had opportunity. Remember, he was waiting in the hotel lobby until nearly midnight, hoping to confront Graysmith when he returned. Then who? Miss Marple picked up the authentication folder that Captain Blythe had provided, examining the documents with renewed interest. Among the papers was a certificate of authenticity signed by Felix Graysmith, but countersigned by another expert whose name she recognised. Mrs. Hemmings, she said quietly. Drusilla Hemmings, clock and automaton specialist. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant chiming of the church clock striking 4. Mrs. Hemmings signed this authentication certificate, Miss Marple continued, which means she examined Monsieur Farceur closely enough to verify its genuineness, but in doing so she would also have noticed any modifications to the mechanism. You're suggesting she discovered the fraud. I'm suggesting she discovered something even more significant. She realised that the automaton had been deliberately modified to make it potentially lethal, and she understood that someone was planning to use it as a weapon. Miss Marple set down the papers and faced the group with the expression of someone who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. The question is, did she try to prevent the murder, or did she decide to ensure that justice was served by allowing it to proceed? Chapter 9. 7 chimes, but the doll's eyes close. The tower clock of St. Mary Mead had just finished striking 7 when Miss Marple made her request with the quiet authority that her friends had learned to respect, even when they couldn't quite understand her reasoning. Captain Blythe, she said gently, I wonder if you would be so kind as to wind the ballerina music box once more. I should very much like to observe its behaviour under precisely controlled conditions. Inspector Slack looked as though he might object to what seemed like an unnecessary delay, but something in Miss Marple's manner suggested that this was far from a frivolous request. I'm not sure I understand the purpose, Captain Blythe replied, though he was already reaching for the brass key that Sergeant Lake had recovered from Stephen March's trunk. Indulge an old woman's curiosity, if you would. I have a theory about the timing of events on Tuesday evening, and this little experiment might prove quite illuminating. As Captain Blythe fitted the key into the mechanism, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the music box and the faces of everyone present. Lydia stood near the window, her expression anxious but resigned, while Inspector Slack and Sergeant Lake watched with the professional patience of men who had learned that Miss Marple's theories often led to unexpected revelations. The first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz emerged sweet and clear, the ballerina beginning her graceful rotation in the shaft of late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the shop window. But Miss Marple was listening not just to the melody, but to the subtle variations in tempo and tone that spoke of the mechanism's hidden damage. The tune progressed normally for perhaps 30 seconds, the ballerina turning with mechanical precision, her painted face serene and unchanging. Then, as Miss Marple had anticipated, the music began to falter. The notes became irregular, stuttering slightly as the cylinder encountered the hairline crack that marred its surface. "There," she said softly, as the melody dissolved into the rhythmic clicking that had so disturbed her during the inquest. "Do you hear that particular sound, Inspector? That metallic clicking, like a metronome counting time?" "I hear it," Inspector Slack replied, though his tone suggested he failed to grasp its significance. "It's the sound of the mechanism sticking on the damaged section of the cylinder. The crack causes the music comb to catch and release in a regular pattern, creating that distinctive rhythm." Miss Marple moved closer to the music box, her eyes fixed on the ballerina's painted features. "Captain Blythe? When exactly did this damage occur?" "During the move, as I mentioned. The removal men were rather careless with some of the more delicate pieces." "And when was it repaired?" Captain Blythe's face had taken on the greyish pallor that Miss Marple had learned to associate with the moment when truth finally overwhelmed deception. "Tuesday afternoon. Lydia worked on it while I was dealing with other matters." "What other matters?" The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the music box's mechanical clicking. Finally, Captain Blythe spoke with the weary resignation of a man who had carried a burden too heavy for his shoulders. "I was meeting with Graysmith. He had demands that went far beyond his original agreement to authenticate pieces for a modest fee." "What sort of demands?" "He wanted a 50% share of all profits from the restored pieces, said he had evidence of our enhancements that could destroy the business and send us both to prison for fraud." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So you agreed to meet him again that evening to discuss terms?" "I had no choice. He was threatening to expose everything unless I agreed to his demands immediately." Inspector Slack had pulled out his notebook and was writing rapidly. "And during this meeting you argued?" "Violently. He was completely unreasonable, demanding not just money but control over which pieces we offered for sale. He said he had clients who would pay extraordinary sums for authentic pieces, and he intended to supply them regardless of the methods required." Miss Marple observed that the music box had finally wound down, leaving the ballerina frozen in mid-turn. But the crack in the cylinder had heated from the friction of the mechanism, and the hastily applied resin cement was beginning to soften and darken. "Captain," she said quietly, "I believe you've been trying to protect someone just as Lydia has been trying to protect you. But I don't think either of you is responsible for Mr. Graysmith's death." "Then who?" Miss Marple moved to the window display where she could observe the street outside. The evening light was fading, and shopkeepers were beginning to close their establishments for the day. But her attention was focused on a small, bird-like figure approaching the toy shop with the determined stride of someone who had made a difficult decision. "I believe," she said softly, "that we're about to receive a visitor who can answer that question herself." The shop door chimed, and Mrs. Drusilla Hemmings entered with the brisk efficiency that characterised all her movements. She was dressed in her best black coat, and her usually shrewd eyes showed signs of a sleepless night and considerable inner turmoil. "Inspector Slack," she said without preamble, "I understand you've been investigating poor Mr. Graysmith's death. I believe it's time I told you what I know about Tuesday evening's events." The small group gathered around her with the collective attention of people who sensed that a crucial moment had arrived. Mrs. Hemmings accepted the chair that Captain Blythe offered, but remained perched on its edge as if ready to flee at any moment. "I came to the shop Tuesday evening around 6 o'clock, she began, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. "Captain Blythe had asked me to examine Monsieur Farceur more closely, as there had been some questions about its authentication." "Questions from whom?" Inspector Slack asked. "From Mr. Graysmith. He claimed to have a client who was suspicious about the automaton's provenance, and he wanted my professional opinion about certain modifications to the mechanism." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what did you discover?" "That the automaton had indeed been modified, but not in the way I expected. Someone had deliberately altered the safety mechanisms that normally prevent the jaw blade from extending beyond its housing. The modifications were subtle but unmistakably intentional. Intentional how? Mrs. Hemming's hands worked nervously at her handbag clasp. A small wedge of sandalwood had been inserted into the spring mechanism, creating tension that would cause the blade to snap outward with considerable force when the automaton was fully wound. It was a trap, Inspector. A deadly trap designed to kill whoever was curious enough to examine the mechanism closely. Inspector Slack had stopped writing and was staring at her with obvious shock. You're saying someone had already booby-trapped the automaton before Tuesday evening? Yes, and I realised immediately who the intended victim must be. Mr. Graysmith was known throughout the collecting community for his habit of examining valuable pieces personally, often winding them to test their mechanisms. So what did you do? Mrs. Hemmings was silent for a long moment, her weathered face reflecting an internal struggle between duty and justice. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I removed the sandalwood wedge and reset the mechanism to its normal operating parameters. I thought I had prevented a murder. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the silence that followed. But someone replaced the wedge after you left, didn't they, Mrs. Hemmings? Yes, the older woman replied, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. When I heard about Mr. Graysmith's death, I knew immediately what had happened. Someone had discovered what I'd done and restored the deadly modification. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting Mr. Graysmith dead? Mrs. Hemmings nodded miserably. Someone who knew that I had tried to save him, and who decided that justice required his death regardless of my interference. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to where Captain Blythe stood, frozen with shock and horror. Someone who had access to sandalwood oil, who understood clockwork mechanisms intimately, and who had discovered not just the authentication fraud but something far worse. She turned to face the group with the expression of someone who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex and tragic puzzle. Someone who realised that Mr. Graysmith wasn't just a victim of the trap, but the person who had set it in the first place. Chapter 10, Spinning Top Justice. The revelation that Felix Graysmith had set his own deadly trap hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that transformed every assumption they had made about Tuesday evening's tragic events. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch while she arranged her thoughts with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the final explanation must account for every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Inspector Slack, she said finally, I believe we should gather everyone in the front window of the shop, where the villagers can observe our proceedings. In my experience, the truth is best served when it's witnessed by the community that has been touched by these events. Within minutes, a small crowd had assembled outside Blythe's antique toy emporium, drawn by the unofficial but efficient communication network that operated in all small villages. Mrs. Bantry pressed close to the window, her face bright with curiosity, while Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Clement flanked her with expressions of grave concern. Even Freddie Scales had abandoned his carpentry to join the gathering, his work-stained hands clasped nervously behind his back. Inside the shop, Miss Marple positioned herself near the window display where the ballerina stood in her eternal pose, the recovered key glinting in the evening light. The assembled suspects and witnesses formed a semicircle around her, their faces reflecting various degrees of anxiety, guilt, and confused hope. The story begins, Miss Marple said in her clear, carrying voice, not with Tuesday evening's tragedy, but with a much older crime, the systematic deception of collectors who trusted Mr. Graysmith's expertise and Captain Blythe's reputation. She gestured toward the stock ledger that lay open on the counter. This ledger tells the tale of an increasingly elaborate fraud. Items listed as original antiques were in fact clever reproductions, created by combining salvaged Victorian parts with modern craftsmanship. The work was so skillful that only an expert examination would reveal the deception. Captain Blythe's weathered face showed the exhaustion of a man who had carried too many secrets for too long. It started innocently enough. A small enhancement here, a careful restoration there. But Graysmith kept demanding more ambitious projects, and the profits were considerable, Miss Marple agreed gently. But profits built on deception have a way of corrupting even the most honourable intentions, and Mr. Graysmith, I believe, had plans that went far beyond simple fraud. She moved to Monsieur Farceur's display case, where the automaton stood in silent splendour. Mrs. Hemmings discovered that the automaton had been deliberately modified to become a weapon, A sandalwood wedge inserted into the spring mechanism would cause the jaw blade to snap outward with lethal force when the figure was fully wound. But who would do such a thing? Inspector Slack asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand. Someone who knew that Captain Blythe had arranged to meet alone with a man who posed an increasingly dangerous threat to their livelihood. Someone who understood that Mr. Graysmith's habit of personally examining valuable clockwork pieces made him vulnerable to such a trap. Miss Marple paused, studying the faces around her. The question is, who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to create such a deadly modification? Mrs. Hemming shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I told you, I found the wedge already in place when I examined the automaton Tuesday evening. I removed it because I couldn't bear the thought of anyone being killed, even someone as unscrupulous as Graysmith. Yes, you did remove it, but someone replaced it before Mr. Graysmith's arrival at 11 o'clock. Someone who knew about your intervention and decided that justice required a different outcome. Miss Marple turned to Captain Blythe with an expression of infinite sadness. Captain, when did you first discover that Mr. Graysmith had set the trap himself? The colour drained from Captain Blythe's face as if she had struck him a physical blow. How did you... Your sea-log handwriting appears throughout the stock ledger, but there are also entries in a different hand. Not Lydia's careful script, but someone else's notations. Someone who had been examining your records very carefully indeed. She moved to the ledger and turned to a page near the back. Here, in the margin beside the entry for Monsieur Farceur, someone has written modified mechanism. Check spring housing before demonstration. The handwriting is distinctive, with the careful loops of someone accustomed to precise technical notation. Inspector Slack peered at the notation with growing interest. Whose writing is that? I believe it belongs to Mr. Graysmith himself. He made this note after modifying the automaton, as a reminder to himself about the deadly alteration he had created. The implication struck the assembled group like a cold wind. Lydia gasped audibly, while Mrs. Hemmings pressed her hand to her mouth in horror. You're saying Graysmith planned to kill Uncle Horace, Lydia whispered. I'm saying that Mr. Graysmith had grown tired of sharing profits and had devised a permanent solution to what he saw as an inconvenient partnership. Captain Blythe's death would appear accidental, leaving Mr. Graysmith free to claim the entire collection and continue the fraud with a new, more compliant partner. Miss Marple's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. But someone discovered the plot and decided that the trap should claim its intended architect instead of its intended victim. She turned back to Captain Blythe, whose shoulders were now shaking with suppressed emotion. You found Mr. Graysmith's notation in the ledger, didn't you, Captain? You realised what he had planned, and you understood that Mrs. Hemmings had unknowingly saved your life by removing the wedge. I came back to the shop around 10 o'clock, Captain Blythe said in a voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to review the documentation before our meeting. When I saw his notation in the ledger, I couldn't believe it at first. Then I examined the automaton and found the sandalwood wedge that Mrs. Hemmings had removed, lying on the floor beside the case. And you put it back. Yes. I put it back exactly where Graysmith had placed it originally. I used my sailor's knowledge of knots and springs to ensure the mechanism would function as he had intended. Inspector Slack had his notebook ready, but his expression showed more sadness than professional satisfaction. You deliberately restored a deadly trap, knowing that Graysmith would trigger it himself. He came to the shop at 11 o'clock, full of arrogance and threats, said he had a new proposition that would make us both wealthy beyond our dreams. When he saw that the automaton was already running, he couldn't resist examining the mechanism more closely. Captain Blythe's voice broke slightly. I tried to warn him. I told him the piece was delicate, that he should let me demonstrate it properly. But he pushed me aside, said he knew more about clockwork than any simple seaman could understand. And the overwinding. I never touched the mechanism. His own greed and curiosity killed him. He wound the spring far beyond its safe limits, and the wedge he had placed there did exactly what he had intended it to do to me. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Poetic justice, one might say. The trap claimed its creator rather than its intended victim. Outside the window, the gathered villagers had been following the proceedings with rapt attention. Mrs. Bantry's face showed a mixture of horror and fascination, while Dr. Hyduck nodded with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd seen enough of human nature to find few surprises in its darker manifestations. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with obvious reluctance. Captain Blythe, I'm afraid I'll have to charge you with manslaughter at the very least. You had a duty to prevent a death, even the death of someone who meant you harm. I understand, Inspector. I've been carrying this burden for days, and I'm almost relieved to have it ended. Miss Marple moved to the window where the ballerina stood poised in her eternal arabesque. There is one final detail that troubles me, Captain. The ballerina's key was damaged during these events, requiring hasty repairs with resin cement. How did that happen? The key broke when I was removing the wedge from the automaton's mechanism. The metal was old and brittle, and the stress of working in that confined space. He shrugged helplessly. I panicked and tried to mend it with resin from my watch repair kit, but the damage was too extensive for a proper repair. Hence the clicking sound that revealed the crack during our demonstration today. Yes, another reminder of my guilt, if one were needed. As Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple turned to address the crowd gathered outside the window. Ladies and gentlemen of St. Mary Mead, we have witnessed tonight a most unusual form of justice. A man who set a deadly trap for an innocent victim found himself caught in his own snare, while the intended victim became both judge and executioner. She paused, studying the faces pressed against the glass. I hope we might all remember that even the most innocent hobbies can become corrupted when greed overcomes honesty, and that sometimes the clockwork of justice, like the mechanisms in this shop, operates in ways we might not expect. Later that evening, as Inspector Slack led Captain Blythe away and the crowd dispersed into the gathering darkness, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry in the parlour behind the shop. Lydia and Mrs. Hemmings worked quietly together, beginning the process of cataloguing the shop's true inventory and planning its transformation into an honest restoration business. Such a complex case, Dolly observed over her peppermint tea. I'm not sure I understand all the moral implications. Miss Marple smiled gently as she worked at her knitting. Even the simplest clockwork, my dear, can spring back in deadly fashion when wound by greed. Captain Blythe may have allowed justice to take its course, but he forgot that justice should be tempered by mercy. In the end, both men paid a price for their deceptions, though perhaps not the price either had originally intended. Outside, the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled peacefully in the darkness, and the clockwork toys in their cases ticked quietly toward another dawn, their mechanisms restored to their proper function, and their secrets finally revealed.